Hey guys, so today you and I are going to talk about identifying if you're under the influence of imposter syndrome or the Dunning-Kruger effect. So let's get into it. So the question in question was, hi Frederick, I have heard that all programmers go through the Dunning-Kruger effect and the imposter syndrome during their career. How can I detect if I am influenced by any of these mental states? Well, if I remember correctly, the Dunning-Kruger effect is to think that you're smarter than you actually are, if I recall correctly. And if we're going to play a philosophical game, that every single one of us is technically, it might be possible that you are under the influence of that thing right now. You could be there right now. The imposter syndrome is probably a little bit easier to spot whether or not you are influenced by this. I will just back this up and say one thing first, and this is where I argue that the main difference between people who really could use the help of a psychiatrist or a therapist or something like that versus people who are probably able to rectify this problem a little bit by themselves. There is a very nice saying or analogy that I can't remember who said it, but basically the description that I got was that most of us work in the way of you can picture your emotions as being an elephant, and then there's this little person, you, sitting on top of the elephant, which is your rationality and your logical thinking and so forth. And as long as your emotions are in check and willing to cooperate, the logical and reasonable part of you is going to be able to steer the elephant. But if you make the elephant rampage or something happens that spooks the elephant, it doesn't matter how rational you are. You're not going to steer the elephant in the direction you want. It's going to do what it wants. And people who are who are very emotional, they tend to have this, when things get stressful or unexpected things happen, and we're all different here, it becomes very hard for you to just kind of calm yourself down. You might need to talk to somebody who is a little bit more rational and who has a high emotional intelligence and can help you through that thing. So I just want you to know that what I'm going to tell you now very much depends on whether or not you're able to do that. If you're not able to have a certain level of distance from your own emotions and do some meta thinking, this will be very hard, and you probably need to talk to somebody about it. And then I suggest that you talk to a therapist. But let's take the Dunning-Kruger effect. So as I was saying, if we go with the broadest philosophical thing possible, where in software development, I like to call these people philosophers, where they think they're smarter than they actually are. I suppose that if we want to make this a little bit more abstract than just specifically when you're writing code, I would say that you know that you're under the Dunning-Kruger effect when you think that something is probably fairly easy, and then it turns out to be a lot harder than you thought. Which happens all the time. You might, one morning you might, it happens all the time. And this is something that I think you should all do. If you think that you are all that when it comes to software development, try and go and do some leet code exercises, or like code katas or something like that, because you think you know your programming language or something like that. And do a few of those exercises and see how well it goes, and how good your benchmarks look. Unless you do competitive programming all the time, it's very likely that you're going to figure that, oh shit, there's a lot of bugs, or yeah, this wasn't as easy as I thought it was. That's a very humbling experience. It doesn't have to be that way, but I find that often and this happens all the time, guys. You think that you know something, but it's only when you test it you realize what you actually know and how well you know that thing. It's one of the main reasons why, at least what I suspect, why a lot of candidates who get into the recruitment pipeline completely botch the technical interview with more senior experiences, because basically you think that you know JavaScript, or you think you know Java or C# or whatever you're doing, right? And then you talk to somebody who really knows their shit, and then you have to explain things to them, and all of a sudden this thing that you kind of just knew how to do, you realize that, well, I just actually know how to use those interfaces. I don't actually know what happens. So that's a very good way of testing if you're under the Dunning-Kruger effect. Just things that you think are easy or something like that, try to do them. And if you produce a lot of churn, if like a lot of people get frustrated with you or whatever, or you're not actually seeing good results, you probably think that you're smarter than you are. As for the imposter syndrome, it's a little bit easier, I would say, because usually the imposter syndrome stands from you feeling as you have something to prove, or you feeling as if you don't fit into the group of people that you are working with. And there is a fairly, I would say, objective, nice way of determining that. And that is to first and foremost accept that you are a different person from everybody else, and not try to measure your value to the company or to the group based on anything besides how well you are producing within the context that you find yourself. In other words, there are people who, like, if let's for the sake of argument say that your other coworkers have a really good, nice relationship with everybody, and you feel a little bit left out, which is natural, let's say because you're new at the job. Well, you're the new person. Of course, you're not going to be able to like sit and be like as sociable as everybody else. But remember, this is a job. You don't try to fit into the best of your abilities, but don't measure whether or not you are a good software developer based on, I don't know, if you're going to all the after works or things like that. Try to be include people and try to be present and like make friends and so forth. But the thing that you should like primarily use as the benchmark for whether or not you have imposter syndrome is if you feel bad and you feel like you're doing a shitty job, even though you produce at roughly the same standard as everybody else. That's the only measurement that should matter. Because if you think about it rationally, if you are delivering at about the same speed, you're writing the same or not writing the same amount of unit tests as your other coworkers, and overall, like, I mean, you can have a snag here and there and so forth, but I mean, overall, you're no worse or better than somebody else, or as I said, within reason, of course. Then you're just one of the people working there. You're just like everybody else, and everybody makes mistakes, and they have good days and they have bad days. And the imposter syndrome usually convinces you that you are not fit to be here, you're the worst, etc., etc. So you have to remember that. The time this gets really tricky for you is when you are a junior software developer and you work with primarily more educated or like more experienced people, because then you might not be able to produce as quickly as them. But then once again, your measurements shouldn't be based on how well they deliver. Your measurements should be based on how well are you meeting the expectations of people around you. And if nobody's complaining about you and you don't get any weird vibes from people that they're hostile towards you or like they want to see an improvement, etc., etc., try to silence those voices and accept that they will be there until you get to a point where you yourself, because this is the whole thing, right? Your mental gremlins are convincing you that you are lower or higher up on the scale, and if you're honest with yourself, you might be right or you might be wrong, but in many cases you're just working yourself up over something that may not even be a reality. So what I want you to take away from this is that the way that I find, at the very least, that you can detect whether or not you're under the Dunning-Kruger effect is to just take something that you think you know and put it to the test. Easy peasy. And that works for practically anything. If you think that you are all that at a specific language, try to go and do some code katas. If you are afraid that you are too pushy at work or something like that, start measuring how well you're doing. This I wish a lot more of the process nerds would get, because well, your process may not be the right thing for this company if it turns out that everything is actually moving much slower due to it. It doesn't matter what Google says. And as for imposter syndrome, try to remember that the only benchmark that really matters is how well are you doing in comparison to the expectations put on you. So if you are a senior software developer and you're working with other seniors, then well, you should produce at about the same sort of rate after a little while. Like usually there's a grace period when you first start. And if you are a junior software developer, don't kick yourself for not producing at the same rate as the really experienced programmers. Just make sure, as long as you meet expectations, you're fine. And you can very carefully ask your manager or so forth, or even coworkers, how you're doing, and do that in a graceful way. And if they're telling you that, well, yeah, no, it's no real problem, don't ask for more. You're not most likely going to get a pat on the shoulder saying where people say how awesome you are at everything. Unfortunately, I wish we could live in that world, but for the most part we don't. So really only focus on whether or not you're meeting expectations. And if you are, and you still feel bad, and you feel like you're not a real software developer, then it's very likely that you have imposter syndrome. Have a great day.